Let's see what the typology of Israel is. Exodus 13:21. Exodus 13:21 says, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, and to go by day and night." Exodus 20 verse 2 says, "I am the Lord thy God, which has brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage." This is a quote from Fundamentals of Christian Education, page 506. "And all the people answered together and said, All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. Thus the children of Israel were denominated as a special people. By a most solemn covenant they were pledged to be true to God." This is Exodus 15:17. "Thou shalt bring them in and plant them in the mountain of thine inheritance, in the place, O Lord, which thou hast made for thee to dwell in the sanctuary, O Lord, which thy hands have established." Okay, so here we see that Israel is called out of Egypt, and God denominates them, He establishes them. But notice that they were a church before they were established, before they were denominated. If you read on in Exodus, it goes through and it shows how God gave the details, every little detail for the sanctuary. He showed them exactly how He wanted the sanctuary set up. He showed them how He wanted the structure set up. But notice that the cloud was with Israel. And the cloud was what? God's presence. The cloud was with Israel before they were established, before they were denominated, before the structure existed. Okay? And Sister White says that the presence of God is alone what constitutes a church. Notice that when God gave them the details and the instructions for setting up the sanctuary, the structure, when they set up the sanctuary, what happened to the cloud? It moved over the sanctuary, and His presence filled the structure. So here you've got a picture of God's people, and the presence of God is with God's people. And then along comes the structure. And the structure is set up in connection with God's people. And God's presence fills both. But what happened to Israel over time? They lost the significance of what the sanctuary was there for. They started worshiping the structure. Look at Jeremiah 7 verse 4. Jeremiah 7 verse 4. "Trust ye not in lying words, saying, The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these." So by the time you get down to the days of Christ, the Jews had so far departed from what God originally set up that they were worshiping the structure. They were worshiping the temple and their hollow formalism, all their ceremonies and their sacrifices, while they rejected and they killed the one that all of that pointed toward. This is a quote from Great Controversy, page 24. "For centuries the Jews had vainly endeavored to show wherein the promise of God given by Haggai had been fulfilled. Yet pride and unbelief blinded their minds to the true meaning of the prophet's words. The second temple was not honored with the cloud of Jehovah's glory, but with the living presence of one in whom dwelt the fullness of the Godhead bodily, who was God Himself manifest in the flesh. The desire of all nations had indeed come to His temple when the man of Nazareth taught and healed in the sacred courts. In the presence of Christ, and in this only, did the second temple exceed the first in glory. But Israel had put from her the pro-offered gift of heaven. With the humble teacher who had that day passed out from its golden gate, the glory had forever departed from the temple. Already were the Savior's words fulfilled, Your house is left unto you desolate. The disciples had been filled with awe and wonder at Christ's prediction of the overthrow of the temple, and they desired to understand more fully the meaning of his words. Wealth, labor, and architectural skill had for more than 40 years been freely expended to enhance its splendors. Herod the Great had lavished upon it both Roman wealth and Jewish treasure, and even the emperor of the world had enriched it with his gifts. Massive blocks of white marble of almost fabulous size, forwarded from Rome for this purpose, formed a part of its structure. And to these the disciples called the attention of their master, saying, "See what manner of stones and what buildings are here?" To these words Jesus made the solemn and startling reply, "Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." I can tell by some people's response that they caught on to that. So here you've got God's presence with his people, and he sets up a structure for them for a reason. There's a reason for the structure. But his presence isn't in the structure until it's united with his people. And as you study this out, you'll discover that the presence of God always stays with his faithful people. So when his faithful people are united with the structure, then his presence fills the structure as well. But notice that at the time of Christ, the Shekinah glory had left the structure. We're told that the Shekinah glory was no longer there. In fact, if you go back and you look into it a little deeper, you discover that the Shekinah glory left the sanctuary when? When Jerusalem was destroyed, the time that Babylon came in and took it. The beginning of the 2520. That's when the Shekinah glory left. That's when the ark was taken and hidden in a cave. That's where it is today, still there in that cave. But that's when the glory left the structure. But notice that God, because God is long-suffering, he always gives them a second chance. So God, the Shekinah glory was departed, but the presence of God came back in to the structure in the form of the Word. So notice that we have this structure and this people, but when the structure and the people separate, the presence of God stays with the faithful people, so it's no longer in the structure. And when this takes place, you'll start to see, and we're going to go through this, but you'll start to see how when the structure and the people separate, there's a division happening between the leadership and the common man. And the structure begins to lord it over the common man. Here you have an example of when the two are united together and the presence of God is in both, but then it separates and the structure starts lording it over the people. This was a quote from General Conference Daily Bulletin, March 7, 1899, and it just simply shows that the Church of God was taken captive to Babylon. The glory had departed from Israel. So this is when the Shekinah glory left the sanctuary. Review and Herald, February 6, 1900. While representing the kingdoms of this earth, the image that was revealed to Nebuchadnezzar also fitly represented the deterioration of religion. We grow weak morally and spiritually just in proportion as we forget God. Those who claim to be Protestants are not today what Luther was. They have left the old landmarks and have depended on forms, ceremonies, and outward display to make up for the lack of purity and piety, meekness and lowliness found in obedience to God. So notice, and this just really gets me because, I had somebody confront me with the idea that the prophecy in the Bible, they said, is it's basically got one application, and if it seems to fit anything else, that's just kind of coincidence. Not according to Ellen White. She says this image, Daniel describes this image as a deterioration of the kingdoms, the world ruling powers. But she says that it also represents a deterioration of religion. So what she's saying here is that prophecy is more than one application. Now these thoughts can all be better understood if we look at a timeline, or like a sequence. Okay, so first off, we have God's people, the invisible church. And the presence of God is with God's people, the invisible church. And then along comes the structure, which is the visible church. And as long as those two are together, united as one, God's presence is in both of them. But as we can see all through history, the next event is apostasy. Apostasy comes in, and the invisible and the visible church separate. There's a forming of what they call a hierarchy. And the presence of God leaves the structure. But when they separate, the hierarchy starts lording it over the invisible church. Then comes the entrance of the Word, which is the presence of God. It's Jesus Christ. And it comes back into the structure. But when this takes place, then you have the leadership and the structure rejecting the Word. And then the presence of God leaves for the last time. And then that brings you right back to number one. God's presence is with the people, the invisible church. Now this sequence of events here, you can see all through history. For example, with the children of Israel, they came out of Egypt, the cloud was with them, the sanctuary was built, they were denominated, God's presence filled both of them, but by the time of Christ, they had separated. The priests and the rulers, the scribes and the Pharisees, they were like this separate class from the common people. And they lorded it over the common people. And at that point, that's when Christ was born. Christ came into the world. You have the entrance of the Word. Christ walked again. The presence of God was again in the structure as a last call to His people. But the leadership and the structure rejected that Word. And He walked out of the sanctuary and He said, "Your house is left unto you desolate." And it's interesting that if you look at this, from that point on, there you have the disciples, the fishermen, the common people, and God was in the process of forming a new church. But the new church doesn't get founded until up here. So then you have the Christian church. This is what Christ was doing with His disciples, founding the Christian church. So here you've got the Christian church. God's presence is with the disciples, with the apostles and everybody, and they form a structure. And they get a system of laws and regulations and stuff, and they come together. And in the early part of that, the apostolic church, you have the presence of God in both of them. But over time, there's apostasy. And the invisible and the visible church are separated. And then you have the hierarchy lording it over the common people. We call that the Dark Ages. All the persecutions that happen. And then here you have the Protestant Reformation. You got the Protestant Reformation where the Word of God is coming on the scene again. And it's starting to call people back. But they reject it. So the presence of God leaves the structure. And then you have, after that, you've got the deadly wound. And the structure no longer exists. And now you have the Protestant church. God forms a new church with the Protestants.